the intent to move, there shouldn't be any time that elapses there, right? There shouldn't be any feedback, any interference patterns that are keeping you from tapping into the emotional drive really that's present to create the intent to win, to compete. And that's really the essence of movement.
That was Seth Lintz, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by Lila Exogen Wearable Resistance. Exogen is used by coaches such as Randy Huntington and Chris Corfist and is an incredible tool in overloading the angular, momentum, and speed aspect of human movement. You can get 25% off of Exogen sleeves by heading to lilateam.com and using the code JustFly25. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today's guest is Seth Lintz. It's great to have him back on the show. Seth is also known as Pitching Doctor on his social media handles. Seth is a pitching and athletic performance coach. He's thrown a 104-mile-an-hour fastball, along with training over a dozen individuals to break the 100-mile-an-hour barrier. Seth uses a progressive training system combining a priority on neuromuscular efficiency within the body, human psychology, and brain science, along with intuitive motor learning concepts in skill building. On the show today, Seth will be talking about his recent sprint training work and how he views the role of sprint training and locomotion alongside pitching and throwing performance. He also gets into innate factors of athleticism, movement, how we interact with the environment, how our mind and body sync and connect, and lead to that total equation and output in our performance. Let's get episode 433 going here with Seth Lintz. Seth, it is awesome to talk to you again. Thanks for being here, man. And I'm excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be back, bro.
Yeah, I watched your videos that you put out, your training videos. I didn't realize you have what looks like a set of stall bars, like the Russian stall bars in your studio, next to like the glute ham and stuff. So I don't know if that's a recent addition, but I really want to put one of those up. I was thinking about doing that in my basement for the longest time.
Yeah, I actually had those in Arizona before I moved here, but you can get pretty creative with those. And I like them for actually creating isometrics within throwing positions in particular. I think that they're perfect for that, and getting your body into some lateral, the side bending aspects as well that you can access with the stall bars, and some of the spinal extension that you can access with those it's hard to find tools that allow you to do that the same way. So they're very applicable for overhead athletes, I would say.
Yeah, it's something that, you think about the decades of past and what went through those decades, what was popular that we shouldn't have left, And I think in the 80s, you saw that the stall bars all over the place. It was just like gym class kind of too, in a way. It makes you think of gym class or whatever. And I posted, I can't, for some reason, his name eludes me at the moment, but it was a Russian swimmer, Salkinov, or Vladimir Salkinov, I think his name was. And he was the first Russian swimmer to break like 15 minutes in the mile, which, with the pools and the tech suits they had back then was like amazing. And the stall bars was a huge part of his training. And he would do this thing where he was hanging upside down and then make like an L with his feet. And funny enough, they had like a metal version of the stall bars at the climbing gym that I was going to. And I remember trying that and I was like, dude, this is exceedingly difficult. Like, it was super impressive what that guy was doing. But it's like, if you use those all the time, it probably doesn't. And the amount of spinal, like not just mobility, but the strength and the connectedness. It's like, now we almost just took it. You see the more complicated versions of that, like the stretching bars. It's like the 360 cage and it's all made of metal. And I'm sure it's amazing, but I feel like, why do we not just do the simple thing first? Like the simplest thing when you can do all these cool, interesting adaptations on it.
I get in the stretch rack and I think I just get confused, honestly. And there, I think the stall bars are pretty straightforward. You can progress that step by step with pretty much anything too. So,
yeah. Well, you've inspired me. That is on my next list of things to get for sure. So, but Seth, I know you've been, well known obviously for pitching, but I know you've been doing a little bit of sprinting lately, like locomotion, gait. Tell me a little bit about your sprint training, either what you're doing on your own or what you're doing with pitchers and how you're connecting that with throwing?
So I've always been a big proponent of sprinting as a correlative or a factor, a direct factor to velocity. Basically, the faster you're able to sprint, typically, the faster you're able to throw. I've always been a pretty big proponent of it, but it hasn't been until over the last year or two, really, that I started to, I guess, connect the mechanics of gait and the typical, I guess, inefficiencies that I see amongst the general populace, I guess, um, manifesting in throwing mechanics. That I started to kind of unify those two things in a way that I hadn't previously seen before. I noticed that as individuals' gait improved, and really first through myself, that as gait improved and I learned uh, how with a sedentary posture, really, and one where individuals lack the ability to integrate their non-dominant side fully, those postural tendencies that result are the same things that I started to see individuals really struggling with when it came to correcting things mechanically within the throw. So it's kind of burning the candle at both ends in a way, where I make guys aware of the positions that they're either not finding or that they are in themselves, they're inefficient. Right? And then I try to find ways of constructing drills or constraints or cues just in general in order to help them and run it, and kind of find that position without thinking about it too much. However, you kind of are burning the candle at the other end by when you're going to the gym and you're working on movement quality, or you're working on which I really see now as just that, gait mechanics or running sprint mechanics. That what my agenda is whenever I put guys in the gym. Yeah, of course we're trying to build power and top end strength and mobility and all those other things too, but it's really within the scope of building those things around improving posture and gait. Because if I can do that, then whenever I give that direction to my athletes from a throwing perspective, and I make them aware of how things should be sequenced, which is a direct parallel to gait mechanics, then they're able to actually find that without too much resistance, right? They're able to make those changes much more quickly. And yeah, of course, that's also due to improved proprioception and internal awareness, right? And all the other aspects of training that you acquire over time. But it's really the intramuscular coordination aspect of it all, that the right parts of the body are working with and communicating with other parts of the body in an efficient manner, and that you're not getting a bunch of interference whenever you're trying to throw the ball or walk or sprint or whatever, any type of movement that you're trying to manifest that you're seeing in your head. There's is there a is it the same mechanics that's going to work for everyone? No, because everyone has different mobility, different strength level set, right? So that's why people are in different bodies, different type of bodies. So they're going to use those tools or that potential that they have within each one of those categories, right, to the best of their ability. And that's what's going to manifest as their mechanical profile, right? But is there a most efficient from a physics and biomechanics perspective? Is there a most efficient way of sprinting or throwing? I think as the whole, yes. I think that the closer that you get to that, the harder you throw and the more efficiently you're able to do that and absorb those forces without injury and on down the line. So my quest recently with sprinting, really, I've been trying to implement more of it in my own training. And my fellows, I've always had them sprint, but I've started teaching it a little bit differently by, I guess, approaching it very similarly to the way that I do the throwing, removing things like having guys take the arms away and cross their arms while sprinting, or just put one arm behind their back and then the other, so that they're able to feel their inability to fully compress into one side or actually rotate fully and sync up the movement of the scaps essentially with the legs and the turnover. So those things have, I think, allowed my athletes to start to see that training, running, sprinting, even just what you're doing in everyday movement, it's really all one and the same. It's the lifestyle, right? That's really going to end up allowing you to access that efficient movement in whatever category of athletics we're talking about here. So,
yeah, the one arm sprinting. I remember the first time I was exposed to that was a Darian Barr had me run a 300 meters fast with one arm. I guess if you want to talk about learning, like just learning what happens, go run 300, because by the time you start to hit those different layers of fatigue, you're going to appreciate how your arm operates. And it's really interesting. Right. And that constraint has been a favorite for me since then. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is if you run it with one arm for a little while, like say 50 meters, and then you bring the other arm in, you feel a very interesting surge of energy that could not be described unless you just did it. Like a coach, it'd be very hard for a coach to tell you. In fact, they would probably complicate the process for the most part by trying to tell you. But in knowing how that feels, so if you're listening to this, try that at some point. But in remembering how that feels when that other arm comes in and you feel that surge, it's a surge that does come from very much the rib cage, and you feel the arms and shoulders operating in a way that's delivering power and torque to the lower body in a nuanced manner. So it strikes me how, if I was to pick a constraint for pitchers and I wanted them to get something out of it, it's like sprinting with shoulders plus, if that makes sense. Like we want that torque driver to be that shoulder operative level. And then one thing I did want to, and if you want to add anything to that, after I ask my next little question here, please do. But I was going to say as well is, I think people who have followed you, you're very well known for like the Russian lunge variations or the speed lunge variations. And obviously pitchers are hitting those types of positions, but that movement is so adaptable to such a variety of human activities. It's like this core thing. It's like, hey, if you're good at this, you could probably be better at XYZ. So I'd be curious for you to mention how you feel like the Russian lunge piece ties into what you're seeing out of them in sprinting and maybe pitching, so as a central facet.
100%. Okay. So to kind of go back to once you're adding in the other arm phenomenon, right? I think that one of the best proponents of that now would be the David Weck he talks about that and emphasizes it a ton, right? With kind of the doubling down pulsatile action of the arms. I think that his emphasis of the head over each foot and the symmetry that is created by tying in the arms, the contralateral oblique sling, that's created from right arm, left leg, and vice versa. I think that's really what everyone is talking about. It's all the same thing, right? It's the sequencing of those moving parts moving in its most efficient timing and rhythm. And it's much easier to feel that whenever you take away certain components that actually might be inducing interference. But we all have what's called a CPG, right? That's associated with various movements, a central pattern generator. So it's the program that you're running when you say sprint and guy just takes off. He's not thinking about his mechanics. That's the program that's running. When I say throw to the fellas and they just throw a ball without thinking about it. Well, we can reconstruct that just simply by giving the athletes, taking something away and then adding it back in and allowing them to feel the sensation of more power, because when we experience less resistance, right, and we experience less friction or interference or inefficiency within a movement, we immediately are going to gravitate toward it because it does feel better for things to be more powerful and for us to put more intent into that movement. It's like whenever you catch the bag flush, you want to hit it harder, right? If you misalign your wrist, though, and you punch that thing incorrectly, it's the last thing you want to do is go harder on the next shot. So it's very much like that with athletics, and that's kind of the quest as a coach, is to create an atmosphere, drill or exercises, choose exercises or constraints, drills, what have you, cues that help your athlete to almost fool him into wanting to do it right, for his own benefit, of course. But as far as the lunges go and all the lunge variation, I think that if you simply look at athletes who are at their top end velocity while sprinting, that's really the essence of the isometric lunge to start with, right? Where we got a long straight back leg, the front leg at 90 degrees at about hip height. That's right where that toe off portion is happening, right before the front leg is coming down underneath the center of mass. And so by starting with the isometric lunges, yes, we're targeting the tendon attachment and the connective tissue, essentially, right, which is what's utilized most when we're moving at top speed. And I think that that's probably one of the most limiting factors to individuals' ability to absorb and absorb force and then express drive from that. And so I think that's why the start of the learning that lunge position can be ensured, and that the tissue that's being targeted is most important with that isometric lunge at end range, because when you look at that top velocity posture, that's really essentially what position that they're in. When it comes to the Russian lunge variations and all that, I think really there's a progression to all that, right? So knowing the entry and exit position, which you kind of can take it to the squat march lunge, which would be similar to a start, and syncing up the momentum from the swing leg and the hip flexor extension, right, from the back leg, from the drive leg. And I'm going from 2 feet to each foot thereafter. And then when you're talking about kind of progressing from the isometric lunge, learning how to absorb force rapidly from an eccentric sense. So like the pulses pulling down into the lunge rapidly, and then making that even faster. So from like plyometric sense, like a vertical jump into a Russian lunge where it's almost a plyometric in nature. And then learning how to, for instance, get off the ground quicker, contract and relax. So you got like tempo lunges where there's kind of just the bouncing, right? And then maybe the speed lunges, the switching, right? Getting each foot off the ground, but having to challenge the length of that hip flexor, switching back and forth. And then the progressing the lunges. So doing consecutive Russian lunges and the amount of time that you're spending on the ground, that amortization phase, right? So there's essentially with each variation of the lunge, you're challenging different components of the athlete's ability to maintain that high velocity position and then manage the forces at play, right, more efficiently. So whenever they're sprinting and they're trying to get off the ground more rapidly, they've already been practicing that. And if you're doing, altitude drop, Russian lunge from any kind of height, the amount of force that you're absorbing upon landing far exceeds the amount of force that you're absorbing whenever you're taking a stride sprinting. Trust me. Just try it out.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a ton going on there with that one. And I have a question about the duration of those movements, because they can be a longer duration, but I did want to ask you quickly, you mentioned the squat march lunge. That's one, I was shown that exercise. Dan Dixon, who had trained with Jay Schrader, showed me that. And I'm doing, it's basically, and I felt like maybe in a previous life or at some point in my life, like doing just aggressive lunges, but it's like this low, it's kind of like a duck walk on steroids is the best way I could describe it. And it's just very aggressive. And it's almost like it does mirror the aggressiveness or violence of acceleration, but then the shin angle is a little messed up because the shin comes down perpendicular. That's the only thing that it doesn't do. But everything else, and actually it got me inspired to the sense of something I occasionally do is I occasionally do sprints that are just with the hips as low as possible. Like, I don't know if you saw that guy. It was like flag football. There's like a move where you just get your hips real low to the ground to evade getting your flag pulled. So it looks like you're doing a lunge while still covering probably like 5 to 7 or so meters a second. I mean, it's insane. And every time I do that in sprinting, especially the first few times I plugged it in, like I had not felt my hamstrings in a good way, like being so worked. And then the next day I was like, ooh, this is nice, and I think sometimes you could do a lot of squats and deadlifts and not get anything like that. And so, I hadn't heard the squat, march, lunge in a while since, I had done those with Dan. So, is that something that, like an acceleration day is like like a warm up there versus, and it also seems like that would be a really good acceleration piece, whereas the lunges the switching lunge is almost more like an upright thing.
Right.
Yeah. Curious how
I think
you
that
put those in.
the squat, march, lunge, I think there's two components to it that are the coordinating aspects of it that are important. So when you're working on the start, one of the hardest things I think to teach someone is that before the lead leg is coming out, right? And then you have the drive leg that is going into what you consider triple extension, right? The lead hip flexor still has to be pulling the knee forward down the track as you are getting to extension with the back leg. And that's what carries the athlete out. So that the momentum that's being created from the lead leg and the drive leg, they're both going forward down the track. And that's what carries the athlete out. So there's almost like a jump out of the blocks.
Yeah.
The sequencing of that swing from the leg on the squat, march, lunge as you're driving out into extension, that's very, very much the same type of feeling. So that coordination of those two things within both sprinting and then that exercise are very similar. I think the other piece of the squat, march, lunge that, yes, it may be premature in the way that the hips are not going to get pulled underneath you and you land in that upright lunge position, right, when you're taking your first couple steps. In fact, the opposite. You want that negative shin angle and for the torso to be still leaning, right, forward down the track.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you do something like wicket training and you actually practice getting those longer strides, basically improving the gait length cycle, and what you must do in order to get that pelvis forward enough so that you're still landing under your center of mass, it almost feels like you're leaning backwards a little bit by comparison with how you normally sprint. And that, whenever you feel that sensation though of the torso being in a position that facilitates that tilt so that you can gain a little bit more of that, I don't want to say four-leg reach necessarily, but you can gain more distance in that gait cycle. There's something very, very powerful about that because it facilitates that knee coming through in a higher position and the swing through again of that leg before coming down. That can also be felt with that squat, march, lunge. As you're going into landing, the pelvis kind of swinging forward and setting up underneath you before pulling down into the ground. Those are the two components with that exercise that I would say. And the other piece of it too, if you're doing them in a way where as you land, you're pushing off and reversing it right back to your starting position, that also has a braking force kind of component to it as well, which is very applicable for pitchers. If you're thinking about going down the mountain, the bracing aspect of things, the force you're putting into the ground and reversing that's what I teach. So once we do go into the squat, march, lunge, we'll go and we'll just do the landing portion first, but then it's progressed into landing and trying to push off back right and do it reverse right back to that starting position. So trying to get off the ground as quickly as possible. So there are a few different elements really that you can use that exercise for to teach, those components of athleticism.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Athletic Development Games. The new Athletic Development Games Play Boost Library is an app that is filled with engaging games to build athleticism in kids ages 4 to 10 in a fun way that builds a love of movement and movement learning. Games include those for speed, hand-eye coordination, jumping, and the essential athletic movements. The app is great for parents and also sports coaches and trainers who are looking to improve their own library of engaging games and ideas for athletes. To learn more and sign up, you can head to athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app. That's athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, I see that with pitchers now, because a pitching, like the front leg, when that front leg hits in front of you in pitching versus an acceleration step, if it's a sprint, if it's a 40-yard dash, the shin angle is going to be as such that, some people say it's negative, some people say it's positive, but basically the knee's in front of the toe, it's angling backwards, and you're going to be going over, your hip's going to go over the top. And for pitching, it's more like straight ahead. It's the opposite way, from my understanding, right? And so that's where it seems like the squat march lunge, it almost seems like it would be more transferable to pitchers, especially because your actual throw, you're absorbing. Yeah. It's on that spectrum of absorbing to propelling. It's actually a more absorbing way of doing it. So it's like, hey, it's almost like, hey, let's have a squat march lunge race, Yeah, it's interesting to think of that, and I think about that a lot in the sense that I'm a more absorbing type person, just the way I move. Like, I'm good at bounding and absorbing actions, and propulsion has not been my superpower, but it's something that I try to steer my training to work on and balance out. But yeah, it's interesting to think about that. It's definitely something I'll loop in complexes as well. And last thing you said, or one thing you said too, is the swing leg. You can't do that exercise without the swing leg really shooting forward quickly. And that is a determinant. It's been researched. I think J.B. Marin was one of the scientists on the study, where 100-meter speed is one of the determinants of swing leg recovery speed. And that exercise is constrained by swing leg recovery speed in many ways. It's a little slower frequency in some senses, but you have to be good at that. And so it's interesting to think, yeah, again, shin angle and absorbing a little different, but I'm going to loop it in some circuits now and see how it goes. I'm excited to try that out now.
I'll tell you, one of the best exercises that I've actually found recently for start training is actually having guys set up where there's two lines on the football field that are meeting in 90 degrees. So let's say like the goal line and then the sideline. And then I'll have them set up basically facing in the very middle of that, so that there's that one line is 45 degrees to their right and another line is 45 degrees to their left. And because I usually have my guys set up in a 3-point start, similar to how a guy would run a 40, so it's football, we do both legs. We train both legs. Even though I'll have them run their, tests for sprinting with whatever leg they choose, but we'll train both. And I'll have them try to essentially take the lead leg that's coming out and take it across their body 45 degrees down whichever line. So if it's my left leg back, then I'm going to try to start. I'll be facing the center. I try to take my left leg 45 degrees across my body and follow it, and then start sprinting down that line. And what that does, I don't know if you've heard of the knee knocking method with starting or staying real tight with the knees, if that's ever been coached. But oftentimes what you'll see with individuals who struggle with the start or with gait mechanics is too much excessive ER, right? Where everything is rotated out and they're not really able to get their knees up and tight to their center. And that very much starts early on. If guys can't get their knee driving straight down the track, then they're probably not going to find that on their first few steps, and it's going to end up throwing off the whole run. But if you look at guys that are like, Bolt has a huge internal first step.
Yes, he does.
Like when you actually do it, and you feel the excess ER out of that. as you're slapping that foot down into the ground. There's a sensation of drive as a result from that you just don't feel unless you really try to over exaggerate that first internal rotation move. So it's almost like we know that our tendency is going to be, as we go, to get more and more into ER. So it's almost like you want to wind the spring back to the negative direction and start with excessive IR, on your first couple steps, in order to put yourself in a position where you have the ability, more room to ER into a straight position. I don't know if that makes any sense, but having guys do 45-degree starts like that, I've had extremely good results in lowering times with that exercise. So it's something I'd never even really seen or heard before, but over exaggerating that first step internal rotation move can really make a big difference in guys feeling how their gait should evolve from there downstream.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. So with the 45-degree, you're saying instead of starting straight ahead, you're 45 degrees off kilter. And then the first step by nature, you're going to have to IR that first leg, because otherwise you're just going to turn the wrong way. So yeah, that's
exactly.
Yeah, I've experimented with that as well, 100%. Because I think you get it a little bit with the 90. That 90 degree is very common, where you're like 90 degrees off center.
Sure.
But it doesn't. It's a little less fluid to hit that internal rotation of the lead leg out of there. But I think it will force you to do that as well. But the 45, it's a little more fine tuned for sure. And yeah, it's like that. I know what you're saying. Like, I think with the person who can't IR, it's kind of like you get the wide infrasternal angle types who are compressed, and they just walk with the knees out a lot, but they're stiff. And there's good sprinters, even wide ISA sprinters who are not stiff and good and coordinated, they just kind of orient and they kind of figure it out. But I've seen wide ISAs who are stiff and don't figure it out. And yeah, there's just no stride length out of that first step. And you could say project, but they don't, their body just doesn't know how to get into that. So it's like you have to,
right.
Yeah, it's almost like in a sense, it's kind of like we were talking about the corkscrew before we pushed record in the upper body, that corkscrew of the shoulders, where it's like one arm IRs and one arm ERs. It's like there's a dance, and I think there's a similar dance happening with the lower body.
Yes, sir. And in pitching mechanics too.
Yeah.
If you create IR in the front leg as you're coming out of leg lifts, and that facilitates ER on the leg that's down. So if you swing that front leg open, you're going to end up in IR with the back leg a lot quicker than if you maintain IR in the front leg, and vice versa. I mean, the same thing is true with the front arm. The IR created by the front arm allows protraction of that scap, which allows more retraction of the throwing arm scap, and so on and so forth.
One of the I ended up not putting this in any of my educational materials, or even I don't even program it for clients. It's just too complicated. I'm the only person that I know has ever done it, but like I was inspired through watching Usain Bolt, and when you get this right, it feels really good if you then accelerate like in a sequence later on. But like it's lunging, but you lunge, and when that leg comes forward, you throw the leg into IR the same way Bolt or any of these guys in acceleration do. But the trick is, right before the leg hits, it has to ER again. You can't hit an IR. And then so every time, it's like your leg is doing a corkscrew when it comes through the air every time, but you start to kind of feel and appreciate the torque that's happening, and you feel what's happening, how your body's building this up. And if you can catch the rhythm, because it's like, it's all rhythms, it's just increasingly complex rhythms, the same way you would experience in music or anything else and dance. And once you get it though, it's like, ooh, like, I feel this innate torque in a way that's not like throwing me too much to the side. It's if you can get that torque to throw forward and steer everything forward, now that's the magic. And it's just cool to see people who are elite athletes just do that naturally, you know. And it's just cool to kind of get a glimpse of what that feels like with some of that. So that's my lower body corkscrewing equivalent to the upper body corkscrew, you know?
That's right. Yeah, that was the kind of slapping down of that foot I was talking about out of that IR position. You just don't feel it unless you load it up IR like that. So that's in part why I started really kind of digging into some of the sprinting work, because as I started kind of applying some of the same concepts that I have with drilling, throwing to the sprinting, I ended up getting these new sensations that were exciting and, made me want to try more things ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so cool how your mind is work and how you being pitching is your big rock, but then even acceleration, we landed at the same place, like that you are out at 45. Like, that's awesome. I've not heard anyone else who's taken it to 45. Seen plenty of 90s, and I appreciate the 90s. So
Right.
that's so cool. With one of the questions that we were talking about discussing, and I think this fits with the lunges real well, just kind of digging into that, is energy conservation, motor unit recruitment, and kind of what happens. I think it's interesting what happens when you take some of these sets longer. Like, okay, do a set of speed Russian lunges, but instead of doing like 3 sets of 10, or, which I'm sure there's good stuff that happens in 3 sets of 10. But what happens if you do 2 minutes? And how does that change the energy systems or recruitment? Or, it's counterintuitive to short sprinting. But yeah, thoughts on shorter or longer modulations of those exercises?
Right. So I think that you got a couple of different things that you can modulate, progress with exercises, right? We can time under tension, right? The amount of time, the duration, the number of reps involved, the load. So if we're talking about an isometric lunge, we could just put a weight vest on you, right? Or uh, there's various components that we can progress with each exercise. If we're talking about, like, let's say a reverse lunge, 1 rep max or something like that, right? Where the focus there, I guess, would be that you're recruiting as many motor units as possible. However, the same thing can in some ways be achieved with time, because that 1 rep max reverse lunge takes 2 seconds if it's performed correctly, and a 5-minute isometric lunge, yeah, you got all your motor units turned on, trust me, and probably even more of them than that 1 rep max if you've done them before. So much so that that's why you start shaking like a leaf after 3.5 minutes in there, because your tissue, its metabolism, after you've already surpassed your aerobic capacity, and now its ability to metabolize energy and to actually convert all your diphosphates and monophosphates right back into ATP that's usable. It's not ready for that. So there is tissue that is out of phase. It's not capable, with that demand being placed on it, of sustaining the position, right? Of still holding an isometric contraction. And that's why it's shaking. That's why it's panicking. But it is also being reeducated too. And that's kind of how you would stage things over time, is, the 0 to 10 second window, and then, glycolysis and creatine phosphate, and you have different energy systems that are being tapped into the launch. And just like you are tapping into different energy systems when you're running a 60 versus a 200 versus half versus 3 miles or whatever, right? But that is what that kind of staging of motor unit recruitment can be tapped into through various stimuli. Now, it can also be tapped into with modalities like the ARP wave and recruiting motor units with that as well. But I think one of the things that is most noteworthy when it comes to recruitment is to note that if I'm getting up and walking to the fridge to get a glass of milk, my body is not going to recruit all my motor units in order to do that, because it doesn't have to. And there's an energy conservation, right, that is taking place there that's actually in our best benefit. That we shouldn't have to have everything turned on at all times, because you probably have to eat 10,000 calories a day in order to do that, right? But at the same time, your ability to recruit the whole system into action and integrate your non-dominant side, which would be considered whatever, your left hand or whatever we're talking about here. That's why left-handed people's brains, they're all thrown out of the studies because their brains are so much different. But the idea is that we all, for the most part, have fewer cortical motor neurons in the right brain that controls our left side. We have anatomy that is different. We have a heart here on the left, a spleen on the left, a liver on the right. We have different psoas attachments on the right side. We all tend to gravitate toward being right-handed because we choose to use that side in a dominant fashion. And we choose to not integrate the non-dominant side into action as often, right? So if you were to learn to do all things equally from birth, then your brain would look very different. And that's why people who are left-handed also have very different type brains, where they have a language center in both hemispheres still, the same as children do. And that usually changes as we adult, and it's now then just in the left hemisphere. The language center is just adjacent to the motor center. So you can't speak and hear in your head the word that you're trying to say without movement from your mouth. And that, in the same way, you can't move and see an image in your head and express it through movement. Those are two very, very similar things. They're both central nervous system expression that involves movement, right? So when we have a sedentary lifestyle that also is full of stimulus, let's say from video games or from whatever, we're talking about cheap dopamine here, however you want to go with that. Okay. Ordinarily, the stimulus should create an emotion that recruits, right, a adrenal response and the neurotransmitters necessary along with the electrical impulses necessary to recruit the whole body into action. And then that's going to carve out a neural network, essentially, after we've chased down that animal and, or whatever, we've hunted that animal, or we've fought for our lives and protected our village or this, that, or whatever else. We've had the dopamine reward now as a result to reinforce that activity, that behavior. And we've also lateralized the brain in a way where we're coherent amongst hemispheres and brain to heart as well, with the emotion that has taken place due to the stimulus. Well, when we're just sitting there pressing buttons and we got emotions that are maybe pretty high strung emotions that also involve anxiety that would ordinarily drive us to move and integrate the system. And then we get that feedback that tells us that really no work being performed is what is the rewarded behavior. Those are all of the short circuits that really we're building in now in the modern age that are causing a lack of integration, and then poor posture as a result. And then when we go to move, right, we go to we get an emotion, we want to go move fast, and we want to go express ourselves from a movement perspective to a high intent. Well, your body is not used to recruiting itself in a way in order to do that, right? So you have the energy saving mechanism too, where your body has a kind of a hierarchy of staging to recruit those motor units, whether it be under intensity or time. And then you also have its connection with the emotion that's present due to the stimulus. And if we're not practiced in after having, that's why I put the Bruce Lee audio to that last post that I made, that when he's talking about you have to train so that your reflexes are sharp and so that when you want to move, it's there. That's really what he's talking about. The intent to move, there shouldn't be any time that elapses there, right? There shouldn't be any feedback, any interference patterns that are keeping you from tapping into the emotional drive really that's present to create the intent to win, to compete. And that's really the essence of movement. That's really where movement had to have originated, was to survive, compete, for survival, essentially, right? And now, yeah, it's really not so much that anymore, unless we're talking about guys that are doing it in war and all that, or maybe fighting in an MMA or whatever. I think that really all of your best athletes out there, that's why they are who they are, is because they're running with their heart, or they're throwing with their heart. And it is life or death for them. You know what I mean? There is a full recruitment of the system whenever they're at play. And it can only really be activated like that regularly and at your disposal if it's regularly activated that way. You know what I mean? If you demand it of yourself on a regular basis. And if you don't, then it is kind of one of those things where if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah. I like how much you and I are on the same brainwave. And one of the things that you said, this was in a prior just phone conversation that you had done, was I think about what you're talking about, lateralizing the sides and the synchronization of mind and heart. And we talked about breathing and a breathing rhythm that you had worked on when you ran, just distance running, just going out for a run. And I was like, dude, like that's because that's when I run, that's one of the things that I really try to work on is breath with steps and things like that. And it's such an embodied experience. It's one thing to go out for a run and okay, here's your time. And that's it. It's time and sets and reps and whatever you got. But then it's entirely another is, okay, well, how did you do that run? And did you have rhythm? And did you time your breath to that rhythm? And once you start doing those things, it's like, well, you're running. So you have both sides of the body and synchronization, and you have your breath. And that can tune, to my understanding, the mind or the brain, I should say the mind, the brain and the heart and the connections and pathways there. So you're getting like all this really, really good information in there. And I guess even too, like iso lunge, where you do it on both sides and you have a breathing rhythm and you're tuning the mind and brain, the heart, and how that fits with reaction time. But it's like in doing those things, it's amazing how when you have a good session like that, the next day, if you're playing a sport, it's like, wow, I'm on point here. And you achieve that in a way that you didn't practice being on point. You just let the system sync up and do what it's supposed to do. Right. And
I think there's a couple aspects to that when you are focused on the breath, right? When you describe it there, it's almost meditative in a sense. When your run is focused on that breath and step rhythm. From what I described to you when we were talking about that was, what's cool is that if I extended my inhale and exhale long enough, then my actual strides broke that inhale into a double inhale, which Human Lab talks about all the time, how that promotes parasympathy. It helps with that tone and promotes more parasympathetic state, and helps to also, it creates elevated nitric oxide levels as well. So it's almost as if regulating that breath helps us to maintain a certain brain state, maybe more toward that alpha brain wave type meditative mindset. And that would coincide with what you just described, because really what you're doing, right, is you're taking the body out of homeostasis, you're putting it in a stressful state, but you're conditioning it through the breath and through a coherent rhythm to accept it in a homeostatic way, right? And that when you go out and you experience stress out on the field the next day, that's almost like you've spent your previous day meditating while being under stress. So you're prepared to handle that stress much more gracefully, whenever you're undergoing it. You just literally practice that, even if it's something as simple as jogging.
Yeah. That's one of the things I like in the ISO holds too, like the longer ones, is it's like so often, Tony Holler just posted this on Twitter. It's like someone's pyramid of success. And it was just crowded with just all sorts of this, like this. Like there's like 40 things and there's no way you could read them all or think about them all. And half of them, or not half, but a lot of them had to do with conditioning and, toughness. And it's almost like that the busyness almost goes one to one with inefficiency and filling things. Just, we got to make sure we do it all. And in excess, and versus, hey, just pick up couple things and just do them with rhythm, do them with breath, do them with this in a way that creates a spaciousness and a withholding almost. It's like a withholding from all the other, busy things. Sport. I just think it's something we just miss. So, but hey, this is a little bit shorter recording, unfortunately. I did want to, before we hop off the call, I wanted to ask a little bit about, with the energy systems and something you said before, like that iso lunge. And this is something I think is interesting because Derek Hansen had posted this a long time ago. It stuck in my memory banks. It impacted me so much, it just stuck in my memory banks. It was probably 2018. And it was something where an EMG reading or electromyography reading on muscle showed that a set taken to failure with a submaximal weight, I don't know, like 70% for 20 reps or something or whatever, elicited a greater brain response. The brain had to pump more juice in the muscle than hitting a 1 rep max. And so it brings up an interesting point. It's like, okay, there is specific adaptations. Yes, if we talk about sets to 20 or failure or long iso holds, we instantly think, okay, slow twitch muscle. There's also a lot of mental fatigue and going 5 minutes. Like I've done a lot of long iso holds and got stronger. I could jump higher. My explosive power is even better, even though those were long. And of course, it wasn't the only thing I was doing. But after a certain amount of time, I'm just like, I don't want to do these anymore. Like you just walk in, it's like, I don't want to do a 5-minute iso lunge anymore. So, just thoughts on balancing those things. Yeah, we probably got like 5 minutes left, but I'd love to hear your take on just how do you balance that in the program, that activation versus the low rep activation and what you're getting in the lunge type work.
Well, I think that it really probably starts with work capacity first, right? So if you got a guy that's very untrained and his work capacity is just trash, then there's really only a couple of ways to get that up. And he's going to have to spend some time doing it. You know what I mean? And it's going to end up sucking a little bit more for him than the kid who comes in and he's been training his whole life. Ever since he can remember, he's been doing stuff, whether it was organized or not. Okay. Whether it was even intelligent training. If the kid comes in, he's well trained and he's a good athlete. And the first time you put him in a lunge, he's ripping 3 minutes or something on his own. Well, is he going to benefit from more isos? Sure, he can. Absolutely. But you can start on the other things that are more built toward power and RFD and, the speed end of things and all that a little bit quicker with him because it's not as high of a risk, right? Like I'm not going to have this kid who's untrained go out there and perform a bunch of sprints right away and do a bunch of really high intensity work because his positioning is also probably trash, right? So you have to end up kind of using these exercises as tools and determine who am I working with, for one. And then how do you prescribe these to not make the guy want to quit either? That's another piece of this, that you could also do it in a way, like you just said, like you knew the benefits, you were doing it to yourself, and you get to a point even still where you're like, I need a break. I don't really feel like doing this. And it's important too, because I think training should not be miserable. You know what I mean? I want the guys to go through it every now and then and be going to failure in the lunges and the other guy standing around rooting them on and talking shit or whatever. Like I really I want it to happen every now and then, right? But I also want there to be a degree of novelty with the training too, where we're trying and we're progressing something a little bit, maybe every day. There's something a little new in there every day that they have to add into what they already know. And I'm not progressing anything more than 10% in workload per week. There's little rules, I guess, to follow down the line that are going to make the training more palatable. And it's the agenda there is not to make guys want to quit. Now, at a really high level, maybe that is the agenda at the beginning. You know what I mean? Where you're going to actually try to weed out some of the weaker guys by really putting guys through it in the initial stages. And is that long duration type work and high volume work the thing that's going to kind of set the foundation for work capacity overall? And then for your high end output work, is that going to manifest downstream? Yeah, it will. So even with your best athletes, you're still going to need to go back every now and then and challenge those things, right? And still progress them a little bit. But you have more room essentially once you have that foundation to venture into other areas that are maybe a little bit more skill oriented. And I think that is probably the real short answer. If you zoom out, that's a real short answer to what your original question was, is keep in mind why you're doing what you're doing. If I'm trying to teach athletes to throw harder, do they need to have a 5-minute lunge? No, they don't. They don't actually have to have that in order to throw a ball 95 miles an hour. Do you even need to have that in order to run a 4.5? No, you probably don't have to have that. But if you have that, does it mean that your work in other areas might go further? Yeah, probably. And I guess that's really the balance needs to lie, is you're never going to compromise your skill work, your ability to work on the thing that's making you money with the training work. The training work supplements the skill work every time if you really want to get results as fast as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. No matter what, there is that human piece to it, and especially too, like beginners versus advanced, there's certainly a lot of factors to consider. But I think too, like the mental and emotional side, this would be another conversation. Sadly, we don't have time, but like it's interesting to also think about the mental, like if you are very physically deconditioned and the links between mind and body, and there's a difficulty as well. And part of the difficulty that lives and sits in some of those longer holds, I think there's a lot of interesting, just how we talk about toughness and conditioning and where it is appropriate and where it's excessive, and where that all does fit in. I think there's some interesting nuances. Yeah, especially on that lower level for sure. And then at the higher level, I mean, like once you get into specialized abilities, it's interesting to, it definitely is an interesting and fascinating topic. And man, shoot, we only got through like 2 questions. So we'll have to get back on a call here soon.
In a part 2 here, man.
Yeah. But it's great talking to you, Seth. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure as always, my man. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here and listening, and I will see you next week.